In the name of God who loves us, God who once walked among us, and God who spurs us ever on. Amen. When the weather heats up, like it has this week, I don't know about you, but I love to get out on the water. There's something cooling and calming and soothing and refreshing about floating on top of the deep blue sea. We were in New England last week, and one of the highlights of the trip for me was the boat trip we took to see the puffins. It was great to be out in the water, and it was a lot of fun watching the puffins too. There is one qualifier to my love of being out on the water. I only like it when the waters are calm and still. I wouldn't want to be near the raging waters in Texas and Mexico now, as those people in those places are dealing with the chaos caused by Tropical Storm Alberto. Stormy waters are terrifying. Many of those Jesus called to be his disciples made their living on the water. They were fishermen. They knew the waters of the Sea of Galilee, which is really a large lake, but still an impressive body of water. They'd grown up around these waters, and now they were venturing out on them in their boats almost daily as they made their living catching fish. As our gospel begins, Jesus asks his disciples to take him out on their boat to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's been preaching and teaching and healing. The crowds were constantly clamoring around him, and he was exhausted. He needed rest, and in order to get that, he'd have to get away from the place where everybody knew him. If he crossed over to the other side of the water, the people there were Gentiles. They didn't know him. The people on the other side were other. They looked different, they believed different things, their customs were different. They would leave Jesus alone, or so he thought. So Jesus gets into the boat with the disciples, finds a cushion in the stern of the boat, and promptly falls fast asleep. The disciples take him just as he was, Mark notes. We don't know what that means. Was Jesus sweaty and stinky? Was he perhaps a little bit grumpy because he was so tired and so in need of rest? We notice a few other details in the scene. There were other boats in the area, and it was evening. It was getting dark, making travel on the water more dangerous, especially in the days before there were running lights and GPS on boats. Not long after they set out, the winds began to stir up. Quickly, they grew strong, and the waves were so high they were swamping the boat. Storms can and do come up suddenly and without warning on the water. And this was long before weather apps and chief meteorologist Doug Kammerer, so there were no storm warnings or watches. When I was in the Holy Land some 30 years ago, you know I signed up for the trip out on the Sea of Galilee in what they called the Jesus boat. We set out on a beautiful, sunny afternoon, but we were drenched by torrential rain before we got back. That storm seemed to come out of nowhere. Fearing for their very lives, the disciples can't believe Jesus is sleeping through all this chaos. Was he that exhausted that he could sleep through anything? Or was he so unafraid that the storm didn't worry him? They wake him up and ask him, "Don't you care that we're about to drown?" Jesus rebuked the wind and the sea, and both were immediately dead calm. And then he rebuked the disciples and asked, "Why are you so afraid? Don't you have any faith?" The text says the disciples were filled with great awe. A better translation of the Greek word is fear. The disciples were filled with great fear. Like the disciples setting out on their boat on that dark and soon-to-be stormy night, Mark's community is in the midst of a journey into such a dark, frightening, and uncharted territory. Not only do they wrestle with welcoming outsiders into their community, the storms of conflict with the Roman Empire are also brewing. Does this feeling or foreboding sound familiar? Does it feel familiar, considering the state of our world? I wonder how the disciples felt about taking Jesus over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They may not have wanted to go into this foreign, unfamiliar territory. I'm guessing they may not have wanted to venture out at night when the trip was more dangerous. How do we feel about crossing to the other side? It's a journey most of us, most of the time, would prefer not to sign up for, because it's usually chaotic and it's often frightening. How do we live in unfamiliar places where the people's customs are strange to us? How do we live alongside the others, those who are different from us? Do we change them, or do they change us? Or do we work, and it is work, to live alongside them, cultivating mutual respect? Crossing to the other side is a crossing we make many times in our life. We leave home for the first time, as our high school graduates are preparing to do. We begin a new job. We retire from a long career. We move to a new place. We begin a new relationship or end an existing one. We go for a checkup and learn we'll be sailing on the uncharted waters of a health crisis. As a nation, we wrestle with how to navigate the tricky waters of immigration, the troubled waters of divisive politics, and the concerning waters of climate change. Every crossing feels like sailing out into the darkness. The distant shore is unknown territory. We often don't know what to expect, and that scares us. Often we don't know how to navigate these unknown waters. Often storms come up unexpectedly. Crossing to the other side is frightening, in part because it's unfamiliar, and in part because we're not in control. Most of us, most of the time, would choose not to make the crossing. But Jesus bids us get into the boat and put up the sail. What do we do when the storm rages, when we lose hold of the people or money or resources we've always relied on to support us? What do we do when the winds shift without warning and the seas swell? What do we do when what's happening in the world around us is so deeply troubling and scary? Like those first disciples, do we cry out, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" Jesus rebuked the wind and water, much as he had rebuked the evil spirits. And then he turned to the disciples and he rebuked them. "Why are you so afraid? After all this time, don't you have any faith?" Jesus makes this sea crossing to the other side with his disciples twice in Mark's gospel. Both trips occur at night. During both trips, a storm comes up. On this first trip, Jesus goes with the disciples, but he falls asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. On the next trip, he'll tell the disciples to get in the boat by themselves and to go on without him. When the storm rages and they panic once again, he'll walk to them on the wind-whipped waters. Each time the disciples let fear overtake them, Jesus seems to get a little more impatient with them. I think he's frustrated that they seem paralyzed by their fear, and they expect him to fix everything. He hopes for them to have at least a little faith. He'd like for them to do at least a little bit of the work. It's said that the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's fear. Jesus confirms that when he rebukes the disciples. They're afraid, and he chastises them for not having enough faith. They were afraid of his power, afraid of who he was. This story occurs fairly early in Jesus' ministry. He'd called the disciples. They'd seen him preach and teach and heal and cast out evil spirits. But they still don't know who he is, really. In Mark's gospel, the disciples are slow to recognize Jesus for who he is. And it isn't until after the crucifixion and resurrection that they fully know him as the Messiah. Now they've witnessed his power over the storm, over the forces of nature. Just as God had spoken in the beginning of creation and calmed the chaotic waters, so Jesus has just spoken and calmed chaotic waters that were threatening to drown them. What kind of power did Jesus possess, they wondered. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office as president in 1932, at the time of our country's greatest depression. "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," he told the American people. In his fireside chats, he kept reinforcing this message. What he was saying, in essence, were the words of Jesus to his disciples caught in the storm. Peace, be still, stay calm. Soon people began believing that the worst was past, that better days were ahead for all Americans. FDR's was a self-fulfilling optimism. He inspired people, but he hadn't always been so confident. Amazingly, it was the storm of polio that gave him strength, gave him faith. From his battle with polio came genuine sympathy for other people who were hurting. FDR learned through the battle with his illness what leadership meant. At Warm Springs in Georgia, where he went for treatment, he helped others who had polio find a life. In battling this storm, he gained tremendous inner strength. If I can endure this, I can endure anything, he learned. We noticed there were other boats out on the water that night with Jesus and the disciples. That's a reminder to us that we're not alone. That point came home to me this week when a clergy colleague in our region shared her cancer diagnosis. "I know I'm not in this alone," she wrote. "I feel the support of family and parishioners and you, my colleagues, and that makes such a difference." Many times we'd rather not get into the boat and leave the comforts of home, the comforts of what we know. But there are times when we need to get into the boat. There are other times when we're forced to get into the boat and navigate the stormy waters. Where do we find the courage to get into that boat and to set out for the other side? Does that courage come from an inner faith in knowing Jesus is in that boat with us? Does it come from the companions who sail alongside us? Where do we find the inner strength, the inner calm that will help us navigate those storms that inevitably will come up in our lives? We may want to avoid those crossings, and we certainly choose to avoid some storms. But it's often through navigating the storms that growth comes, as FDR discovered. May we have the faith to make those crossings, knowing we are all in boats on the same waters. We don't face these storms alone. Most importantly, Jesus is in the boat with us. May our faith be strong enough to believe that. May our faith be strong enough to trust that. Amen.